5.3 Vision. Vision involves a complex chain of events. Light waves reflected from an object enter the eye, passing through the cornea, pupil, and lens. The cornea is a clear membrane covering the front of the eye that helps gather and direct incoming light. The sclera, the white portion of the eye, is a tough fibrous tissue that covers the eyeball except for the cornea. The pupil is the black opening in the middle of the eye. The iris, the colored structure that determines eye color, is actually a ring of muscles that controls the size of the pupil and thus the amount of light entering the eye. The lens is a transparent structure located behind the pupil that actively focuses or bends light as it enters the eye. In a process called accommodation, the lens thins or thickens to focus incoming light so it falls on the retina. If the eyeball is abnormally shaped, the lens may not properly focus the incoming light on the retina, resulting in a visual disorder such as nearsightedness, myopia, farsightedness, hyperopia, or astigmatism. Presbyopia, another form of farsightedness, often occurs during middle age. The retina is a thin, light-sensitive membrane located at the back of the eye that contains the sensory receptors for light, the rods and cones, known as the photoreceptors. Rods and cones are shaped differently. Rods are long and thin with blunt ends. Cones are shorter and fatter with one end that tapers to a point. The eye contains 4 more rods, about 125 million, than cones, about 7 million. Rods and cones are specialized for different visual functions. The rods are more sensitive to light than cones and are primarily responsible for peripheral vision and night vision. Cones are responsible for color vision and for vision in bright light, known as visual acuity. Rods and cones react differently to changes in the amount of light. Rods take about 30 minutes to reach maximum sensitivity to light, whereas cones take about 5 minutes to do so. Most of the cones are concentrated in the fovea, where visual information is most sharply focused. Rods are most prevalent in the periphery of the retina. The optic disc is the point at which the fibers that make up the optic nerve leave the back of the eye and project to the brain. Because there are no photoreceptors in the optic disc, there is a tiny hole or blind spot in your field of vision. Visual information is mostly processed in the brain after it undergoes some preliminary processing in the retina. Information from the sensory receptors, the rods and cones, is collected by specialized neurons called bipolar cells, which then funnel the information to other specialized neurons called ganglion cells. Each ganglion cell receives information from photoreceptors in its receptive field, then combines, analyzes, and encodes this information before transmitting it to the brain. A single ganglion cell receives information from only 1 or 2 cones, but it may receive information from 100 or more rods. Information travels from the ganglion cells to the brain via the optic nerve, a thick nerve made up of axons of the ganglion cells that exits from the back of the eye at the optic disc and extends to the visual cortex of the brain. After leaving the back of the eyes, the left and right optic nerves meet at the optic chiasm. The fibers of each optic nerve split in 2, with one set of axons crossing over to the opposite side of the brain and the other set continuing along the same side of the brain. From the optic chiasm, most of the optic nerve axons project to the thalamus. A smaller number of axons first detour to areas in the midbrain. From the thalamus, the signals are sent to the visual cortex, where they are decoded and interpreted. Receiving neurons in the visual cortex of the brain are highly specialized and are called feature detectors because they detect or respond to particular features or aspects of more complex visual stimuli. Recognition of images involves additional levels of processing in the visual cortex and other brain regions, including the frontal lobes. Color vision, the experience of color. Hue is the property of wavelengths of light known as color. Different wavelengths correspond to our subjective experience of different colors. The saturation or purity of the color corresponds to the purity of the light wave. Brightness or perceived intensity corresponds to the amplitude of the light wave. The higher the amplitude, the greater the degree of brightness. The color of an object is determined by the wavelength of light that the object reflects. The trichromatic theory. According to the trichromatic theory of color vision, there are three types of cones in the retina, each especially sensitive to certain wavelengths. Red light, long wavelengths, green light, medium wavelengths, or blue light, short wavelengths. When color other than red, green, or blue strikes the retina, it stimulates a combination of cones. The tetrachromatic theory explains the most common form of color blindness, red-green color blindness, in which people cannot discriminate between red and green. According to the opponent process theory of color vision, there are four basic colors that are divided into two pairs of color-sensitive neurons, red-green and blue-yellow. When one member of a color pair is stimulated, the other member is inhibited. In addition, black and white act as an opposing pair. Both the tetrachromatic theory and the opponent process theory of color vision are accurate. Each theory explains color vision at a different level of visual processing. Tetrachromatic theory explains processing in the cones in the retina, whereas opponent process theory explains processing in the ganglion cells, the thalamus, and the visual cortex.